They were farmers, shopkeepers, carpenters, blacksmiths. Men who had never fired a musket in anger. Men whose biggest worry, 6 months earlier, had been the harvest or the price of grain at the local market. And they were about to take on the most powerful military empire on the face of the earth. The British Army. The Royal Navy. The most battle-hardened fighting force the world had ever seen, an empire that stretched across every ocean, every continent, every corner of the known world. And these farmers, these ordinary, untrained, half-starved men in their worn-out boots, were going to beat them. Not because they were stronger. Not because they were better equipped. But because of something the British Empire, in all its power and arrogance, never saw coming. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what that was. To understand the American Revolution, you have to understand one thing first. Nobody wanted it. Not in the beginning. In 1763, the 13 American colonies were proud British subjects. They celebrated the King's birthday. They drank British tea. They named their towns after British cities, Boston, Cambridge, Bristol, Manchester. They considered themselves British, just on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. And Britain, for the most part, left them alone. That was the deal. The colonies managed their own local affairs. Britain provided protection. Everyone was reasonably happy. Then everything changed. One war changed everything. The 7 Years' War, what Americans call the French and Indian War, ended in 1763. Britain had won, spectacularly. France was driven out of North America. The continent was safe. But winning a world war is expensive. Britain was drowning in debt. The national debt had nearly doubled during the war. And the British government looked at the American colonies, prosperous, growing, protected by British blood and British money, and made a decision that would ultimately cost them an empire. They decided the colonies should pay for their own protection. And that decision lit a fuse that would burn for 12 years before it exploded. The taxes came one after another. The Stamp Act of 1765. Every legal document, every newspaper, every playing card, taxed. The Townshend Acts of 1767. Taxes on glass, paper, paint, tea. To the British Parliament, this seemed completely reasonable. The colonies were wealthy. The war had protected them. They should contribute. But to the colonists, something felt deeply, fundamentally wrong. And it wasn't really about the money. The money was almost beside the point. It was about a principle so simple, so powerful, that once people heard it they couldn't unhear it. No taxation without representation. If Britain was going to tax them, the colonists wanted a voice in Parliament. They wanted the same rights as every British citizen living in London or Edinburgh or Bristol. Britain said no. And in that single refusal, the empire planted the seed of its own destruction. The anger built slowly. Then all at once. Boston was always the most restless city. Crowded, proud, argumentative. A city of dockworkers and merchants and printers who had opinions about everything and the newspapers to share them. On the evening of March 5, 1770, a group of Boston men and boys began harassing a small squad of British soldiers outside the custom house. Throwing ice. Throwing rocks. Shouting. Pushing. The soldiers were terrified. Outnumbered. Surrounded by a hostile crowd in a city that hated them. And then someone fired. We still don't know exactly who. 5 colonists died on that street. The first to fall was a man named Crispus Attucks, a black man, a dockworker, a son of a slave and a Native American woman. He became the first martyr of a revolution that hadn't started yet. The British called it a riot. The colonists called it a massacre. Samuel Adams, the most dangerous political mind in Boston, called it exactly what he needed it to be, a story. A piece of propaganda so powerful that Paul Revere engraved it into an image that spread through every colony like wildfire. The Boston Massacre. The revolution didn't start that night. But something broke that night. Some invisible line was crossed. And everyone felt it, even if they couldn't name it yet. 3 years later, the tea came. In 1773, Britain gave the East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies. Cheaper tea, yes, but taxed tea. And colonists saw through it immediately. This wasn't about tea. It was a test. Could Britain force the colonies to accept taxation? On the night of December 16, 1773, a group of men called the Sons of Liberty, some of them disguised roughly as Mohawk Indians, faces darkened with coal dust, boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor. They worked for 3 hours in near silence. 342 chests of tea. Systematically broken open with axes and hatchets. Dumped into the black water of Boston Harbor. 10,000 pounds worth of tea destroyed. About $1.7 million in today's money. And not a single thing stolen. Not a single sailor harmed. Not a single window broken on shore. It was not a riot. It was a statement. Precise, disciplined, deliberate. Britain's response was the coercive acts. The colonists called them something else. The intolerable acts. Boston Harbor was closed. Massachusetts lost its self-governance. British soldiers could be housed in colonists' homes without permission. Trials for British officials would be moved to Britain. Britain thought punishment would break the resistance. Instead, it united 13 colonies that had previously argued about almost everything. The revolution was no longer a Boston problem. It was an American problem. By the spring of 1775, everyone knew something was coming. The question was just when and where. The British General Thomas Gage knew the colonists were stockpiling weapons in Concord, a small town 18 miles from Boston. On the night of April 18, 1775, he sent 700 soldiers to seize those weapons. Quietly. Before dawn. But Boston had eyes everywhere. Paul Revere rode that night. William Dawes rode. Samuel Prescott rode. 3 men on horseback, splitting up across the countryside, hammering on farmhouse doors in the darkness. The regulars are out. By the time the British column reached Lexington at dawn on April 19, 77 militiamen were standing on the village green waiting for them. 77 farmers with muskets against 700 trained British soldiers. The militia commander, Captain John Parker, reportedly told his men something that has echoed through American history ever since. Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here. A shot was fired. Again, no one knows by whom. 8 militiamen died on that green. 1 British soldier was wounded. The British marched on to Concord, found most of the weapons already moved, and began the march back to Boston. And that's when everything changed. Because now the countryside was awake. From every farm, every tree line, every stone wall along the road back to Boston, militiamen appeared. Firing and melting back into the woods. Firing again. The British column, trained for open European warfare, trained to stand in lines and fire in volleys, had no answer for this. By the time the British reached Boston, 73 of their men were dead. 174 wounded. 26 missing. The first day of the American Revolution cost the most powerful army in the world nearly 300 casualties. Against farmers. The news spread through the colonies like fire through dry grass. Within days, thousands of men were marching toward Boston. Farmers from Connecticut. Frontiersmen from New Hampshire. Shopkeepers from Rhode Island. Within weeks, the British garrison in Boston was surrounded by a ragged, disorganized, but enormous colonial army. The problem was obvious immediately. This army had no professional structure. No unified command. No supply system. No artillery. No real training. Men elected their own officers. Soldiers went home when they felt like it. Some units had muskets. Some had hunting rifles. Some had only farm tools. It was, by any military standard, a disaster waiting to happen. And on June 17, 1775, the disaster nearly happened. Breed's Hill. Bunker Hill. Whatever you call it, a fortified colonial position on high ground overlooking Boston, built overnight by exhausted men with shovels and raw determination. The British looked at that hill and made a decision that told you everything about how they saw this war. They marched straight at it. In broad daylight. In full formation. Uphill. Against a fortified position. In June heat. With full kit. Because surely these farmers would break and run. Surely the sight of British redcoats in perfect formation, bayonets glinting in the sun, drums beating, flags flying, surely that would be enough. It wasn't. The colonial commander, William Prescott, gave an order that has become legend. Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes. The colonists held. They let the British come. And come. And come. Up the hill through the tall grass. And then they fired. The British line collapsed. Fell back. Regrouped. Marched up again. Collapsed again. 3 times the British charged that hill. 3 times they were thrown back. The dead redcoats lay in the grass in windows. Only on the 3rd charge, when the colonists had run out of gunpowder and were fighting with musket butts and rocks, did the British take the hill. They took the hill. But they lost over 1,000 men to do it. Nearly half their attacking force. Including 92 officers, an almost crippling loss of experienced leadership. After Bunker Hill, no British officer would ever again confidently say that colonial militiamen would simply run. In Philadelphia, the Continental Congress was wrestling with a question that seemed almost impossible. Who leads this army? The man they chose was not the most experienced general. He was not the most brilliant tactician. He had actually lost more battles than he'd won in his earlier military career during the French and Indian War. But George Washington had something that no battlefield education could teach. He had presence. 6'2" in an era when the average man stood 5'7". Broad-shouldered. Calm under pressure in a way that other men found almost supernatural. When Washington walked into a room, people stopped talking. And perhaps more importantly, he was from Virginia. Choosing a Southern commander for what had been a New England war was a political masterstroke. It told the Southern colonies this was their fight too. Washington rode north to take command of the army outside Boston in July 1775. What he found nearly broke him. Men sleeping in the open with no tents. Soldiers sharing muskets because there weren't enough to go around. No gunpowder to speak of. Officers who had been elected by their men and therefore couldn't discipline them. Disease moving through the camp. Men simply walking home when they decided they'd had enough. Washington wrote to his cousin in Virginia that if he'd known the true state of things, he was not sure he would have accepted the command. But he didn't leave. He never left. That, in the end, would be his greatest military achievement, not any battle he won, but the simple, stubborn, exhausting refusal to quit. The winter of 1775 into 1776 was a war of waiting. Washington needed artillery. He had almost none. Then came Henry Knox. 25 years old. A former Boston bookseller. Enormously fat, enormously enthusiastic, and completely self-taught in military engineering from the books in his own shop. Washington sent Knox on a mission that sounded impossible. Go to Fort Ticonderoga, 300 miles away in upstate New York, where Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys had captured a British fort filled with cannons. Bring those cannons back. In winter. Knox looked at the cannons, 59 of them, weighing a total of nearly 120,000 pounds, and he looked at the frozen wilderness between Ticonderoga and Boston, and he said yes. He built sledges. He organized teams of oxen. He moved those cannons across frozen lakes and mountain passes and through blizzards that killed men and animals alike. It took 56 days. 30 warships. 1,200 cannon. Washington had 19,000 men. Many of them sick. Many of them new recruits who had never fired a musket in battle. No navy. Almost no artillery. The Battle of Long Island in August 1776 was a catastrophe. The British didn't just beat Washington. They nearly destroyed him completely. A flanking move that Washington hadn't prepared for put the entire Continental Army in danger of being encircled and captured. In one day, Washington lost 1,000 men, killed, wounded, captured. The British lost fewer than 400. Washington pulled his army back to Brooklyn Heights and looked out at the East River and understood something terrible. If the British Navy moved to block his retreat, the war was over. The entire Continental Army would be captured. The revolution would end in a single afternoon. And then something happened that Washington, for the rest of his life, called the hand of Providence. A fog rolled in off the harbor. Thick, complete, impenetrable fog. In the darkness and the fog, Washington organized a retreat across the East River. Every boat in New York was commandeered. 9,000 men, horses, artillery, moved silently across the water through the night. When the fog lifted in the morning, the British found an empty camp. Washington had escaped. Barely. But he had escaped. The army survived. And as long as the army survived, the revolution survived. The next 3 months were the darkest of the entire war. The British chased Washington across New Jersey. The Continental Army shrank with every passing day. Enlistments expired and men went home. Some simply deserted. At the beginning of 1776, Washington had 19,000 men. By December, he had fewer than 3,000. 3,000 men. Against the British Empire. Thomas Paine, the writer and revolutionary, traveled with the army through those terrible weeks. He wrote by firelight, on a drumhead, the words that would be read aloud to every regiment still standing. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country, but he that stands it now, deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Washington had those words read to every man remaining in his army. And then he made a decision that would either save the revolution or end it in disaster. He would cross the Delaware River on Christmas night, 1776, in a blizzard, in the dark, with boats barely large enough to carry the men and their horses, and attack the Hessian garrison at Trenton, New Jersey. The Hessians were German mercenaries hired by Britain. Professional soldiers, tough and experienced. And on Christmas night, Washington believed, they would be celebrating. Relaxed. Drunk, perhaps. The crossing took 9 hours instead of the planned 3. The blizzard turned into a full nor'easter. Men rode through ice chunks in the Delaware River. 2 men froze to death during the crossing. Washington reportedly stood at the front of his boat, watching the opposite bank emerge from the darkness. At 8 in the morning on December 26, the Continental Army hit Trenton from 2 directions simultaneously. The battle lasted 45 minutes. The Hessians, shocked, disoriented, many of them still half asleep, surrendered. 900 prisoners taken. Their commander, Colonel Rahl, was mortally wounded. The Continental Army suffered no combat deaths. 10 days later, Washington struck again at Princeton. Another victory. In 2 weeks, the entire mood of the war had changed. The revolution was not dead. It was dangerous. France was watching. France had been watching since the beginning, actually. The French had lost Canada to Britain in the 7 Years' War, and the idea of weakening Britain by supporting her rebellious colonies was very appealing. But France was not going to back a losing cause. France needed to see that these Americans could actually fight. Saratoga gave them that proof. In the autumn of 1777, a British general named John Burgoyne led an army of 8,000 men south from Canada toward Albany, New York. The plan was to split the colonies in two along the Hudson River, cutting off New England from the rest. It was a good plan on a map. It collapsed in the forests of upstate New York. The American commander, Horatio Gates, and the brilliant and volatile Benedict Arnold, met Burgoyne at Saratoga. In two battles, September 19 and October 7, the Continental Army systematically dismantled Burgoyne's force. Arnold, wounded in the leg and technically relieved of command, rode onto the battlefield anyway, riding between the lines, rallying men, personally leading charges, his horse shot from under him, his already wounded leg broken again when the horse fell on him. On October 17, 1777, General Burgoyne surrendered his entire army. 5,800 British and Hessian soldiers laid down their arms. It was the single largest surrender of British forces in the entire war. And in Paris, Benjamin Franklin, America's ambassador to France, the most famous scientist in the world, beloved by French society, used Saratoga to do what he had been working toward for months. He walked into the French Foreign Ministry and made the case that America could win this war. On February 6, 1778, France signed a formal alliance with the United States of America. The revolution had just changed from a colonial rebellion into a world war. But before the French could make a difference, Washington had to survive the winter. Valley Forge. The name has become synonymous with suffering. And the reality was worse than the legend. Washington led his army to Valley Forge, Pennsylvania in December 1777. 12,000 men. An army that had been fighting and marching for 2 years. Exhausted, hungry, sick, under-equipped in ways that are almost impossible to imagine. 2,500 men died at Valley Forge over that winter. Not in battle. From cold. From hunger. From disease. From despair. Men went barefoot in the snow because their boots had fallen apart. Washington later wrote that he could track his army's march through the snow by the bloodstains left by bare feet. Men ate their shoes when there was nothing else. They ate fire cakes, flour and water mixed and cooked on a stone. Some days there was nothing at all. Horses died by the hundreds and were left where they fell, because no one had the strength to move them. By spring, the stench of rotting horse carcasses hung over the entire camp. Soldiers wrote letters home that they knew might be their last. One soldier named Albigence Waldo kept a diary through that winter. He wrote about men crying at night. About officers threatening to resign en masse. About the feeling that God himself had abandoned them in those Pennsylvania hills. Washington rode through camp every day. He saw everything. He absorbed it. And he kept going. He wrote letter after letter to Congress begging for supplies, for food, for clothing, for pay for his men. Congress, chronically disorganized, chronically broke, sent almost nothing. And yet, something happened at Valley Forge that no one expected. A Prussian military officer named Friedrich Wilhelm August Heinrich Ferdinand von Steuben, Baron von Steuben, as he presented himself, though the Baron part was somewhat exaggerated, arrived at Valley Forge in February 1778. He had served in the Prussian army. He understood professional military training. And he had never seen anything like what Washington had assembled. He started with a model company of 100 men. He drilled them personally. Himself. On the parade ground. In the snow. Screaming in German and French because his English wasn't good enough to scream in, with an aide translating his curses into English in real time. He taught them to march in step. To reload under fire. To move from column into battle line in seconds instead of minutes. To use the bayonet, which the Continental Army had largely ignored until now. And then those 100 men taught the rest of the army. By spring, Washington had something he had never had before. A professional army. The war entered a new and brutal phase in 1778. Britain, facing French intervention, shifted strategy. Unable to crush the Continental Army in the north, they turned south, to the Carolinas and Georgia, where loyalist sentiment was stronger and the terrain might favor a different kind of war. The Southern Campaign was the most vicious, most personal part of the entire revolution. This wasn't an army fighting an army. This was neighbor against neighbor. Loyalist militia against patriot militia. Men who had grown up together, gone to the same churches, married each other's sisters, now hunting each other through the swamps and pine forests of the Carolinas. British Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton earned a reputation for ruthlessness that made his name a curse word throughout the South. At the Waxhaws in May 1780, his cavalry cut down surrendering Continental soldiers, men who had already thrown down their weapons and raised their hands. The massacre was so brutal that Tarleton's quarter, meaning no mercy, no surrender accepted, became a rallying cry for American forces. But the South also produced the most creative military leadership the Americans had shown yet. A man named Daniel Morgan. 50 years old. A veteran of the French and Indian War. A man who bore 499 lash marks on his back from a British flogging during that earlier war. He always said they'd miscounted and owed him one more. He carried that grudge for 20 years. At Cowpens, South Carolina, on January 17, 1781, Morgan did something that military historians still study today. He arranged his troops in 3 lines. The first line, militia, was ordered to fire exactly 2 volleys and then retreat. Not break and run. Deliberately retreat. Controlled withdrawal. Tarleton's cavalry, seeing the militia fall back, charged in pursuit. And ran straight into Morgan's Continental regulars, waiting in a second line, already loaded, already aimed. And behind them, a line of cavalry that swung around both flanks simultaneously. It was a double envelopment. One of the most difficult maneuvers in military history. Executed by a backwoods general who had taught himself from books and experience. Tarleton's force was nearly wiped out. 800 British soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. Tarleton himself barely escaped on horseback. After Cowpens, the British position in the south began to collapse. By the summer of 1781, both sides were exhausted. The British were spending money at a rate that was strangling the empire. The French fleet was making operations along the American coast increasingly dangerous. And a new British commander in the south, General Cornwallis, had made a decision that would end the war. He marched his army to Yorktown, Virginia, a small tobacco port on the York River, and set up a base, waiting for the Royal Navy to resupply and reinforce him. Washington saw the opportunity immediately. And approximately 100,000 enslaved black Americans used the chaos of the Revolution to escape slavery, some fighting for the British, who had promised freedom to any slave who escaped a patriot master, some fighting for the Patriots, hoping that the words of the Declaration might actually apply to them. For most of them, those hopes would be betrayed. The revolution that proclaimed all men equal would leave the question of slavery explicitly unresolved, a wound it would take another 80 years and another catastrophic war to begin to address. The revolution was simultaneously the most idealistic event in American history and one of its most profound hypocrisies. And the men who built it knew it. Thomas Jefferson, who wrote that all men are created equal, owned 600 slaves over the course of his lifetime. He knew what he was doing. He simply convinced himself, as people throughout history have convinced themselves, that he could hold 2 completely contradictory ideas at the same time. The revolution was real. The ideals were real. The hypocrisy was equally real. And America has been wrestling with that contradiction ever since. So why did Britain lose? The honest answer is not one reason. It's never one reason. Britain underestimated the depth of colonial feeling. What looked from London like a tax dispute was, in the colonies, an existential question about identity and self-determination. Britain underestimated the terrain. Fighting in North America was nothing like fighting in Europe. The distances were vast. The supply lines were impossibly long. The landscape favored exactly the kind of guerrilla harassment the colonists excelled at. Britain underestimated Washington. Not as a general, he lost more battles than he won, but as something more important than a general. As a symbol. As a presence. As a man who would simply not stop, no matter what happened, no matter how bad it got. And Britain underestimated time. The colonists didn't need to defeat Britain. They needed to make the cost, in money, in lives, in international reputation, too high to bear. They did. And now the question I want to leave you with. The men who started this revolution were not superheroes. They were afraid. They were cold and hungry and sick and overwhelmed. They doubted themselves constantly. Washington spent the better part of 8 years convinced the whole thing was about to collapse. But they kept going. And somewhere in that stubborn refusal to stop, in farmers standing on a village green facing 700 redcoats, in men rowing through ice in a blizzard on Christmas night, in soldiers leaving bloody footprints in the snow at Valley Forge, something remarkable happened. People who had thought of themselves as British subjects became something new. Americans. So here is the question. At what point does a group of people stop being subjects and start being citizens? At what point does an idea about freedom, about rights, about the kind of world people deserve to live in, become worth dying for? The men at Lexington answered that question on April 19, 1775. Whether we're still answering it today, I'll leave that for you to decide. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I genuinely want to know what you think. And if this story moved you, the next video goes even deeper into one of the most fascinating and tragic figures of the entire revolution. A man who was perhaps the most brilliant American general of the entire war. A man who saved the revolution more than once. A man who then betrayed it. Benedict Arnold. His story is coming next. See you there.